Some say the hardest moments in life reveal who we truly are. For Clara Duvall, losing her husband to cancer left her holding on to hope by a thread, raising 10-year-old Daniel alone with nothing but determination. When she inherited her uncle's broken-down cabin in the Colorado mountains, everyone in Pine Ridge laughed. The roof leaked, the walls sagged, and the land looked worthless. Clara moved in anyway, believing a fresh start was worth more than comfort. While fixing loose floorboards, Daniel found a hidden trunk filled with old maps and papers. Those dusty documents revealed a forgotten silver claim worth $4 million. The family everyone pitied suddenly held a fortune. But would this discovery bring the peace Clara desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of what locals generously called a cabin. Though Clara Duvall suspected most folks had kinder words for condemned buildings, she sat in the only chair that didn't wobble, cradling a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she stared at the letter that had changed everything. 3 months ago, she'd been Clara Duvall of Littleton, Colorado, wife to Michael, mother to Daniel, a part-time bookkeeper struggling to make ends meet, while her husband fought a losing battle with lung cancer. The medical bills had eaten through their modest savings like acid through paper. Michael's life insurance barely covered the funeral costs, leaving her with a 10-year-old boy, a mountain of debt, and the crushing weight of starting over at 42. Then came Uncle Ezra's funeral, and the reading of a will that surprised everyone who knew the old hermit had any family at all. Clara pulled the letter from her pocket, its edges soft from countless readings. The handwriting was Ezra's careful script, each letter formed with the precision of a man who'd spent his life making marks that mattered. Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're probably wondering why I left you this place. Everyone will tell you it's worthless, that you'd be better off selling what little you can salvage and moving on. Don't listen to them. This land holds more than meets the eye, and you're the only one I trust to understand what that means. Give Daniel my regards, and remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we have to dig for ourselves. Your uncle, Ezra. The cabin certainly looked like the punchline to a cruel joke. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken smile, missing shingles creating gaps that let in both weather and wildlife. The front porch leaned at an angle that defied physics, held up by what appeared to be prayer and stubbornness. Paint had long since abandoned any attempt to protect the weathered siding, leaving behind wood that had turned the color of old bones. But Clara had memories of this place that went deeper than appearances. She'd been 8 years old during her last visit here, back when her father still spoke to his eccentric brother. Even then, the cabin had been rough around the edges, but Uncle Ezra had made it magical for a young girl with stories of mountain adventures and hidden treasures. He'd taught her to identify animal tracks in the dirt, shown her which plants were safe to eat, and filled her head with tales of the old mining days when fortunes were made and lost in these hills. Her father had called Ezra a dreamer, a man who'd never learned the difference between fantasy and responsibility. After that final visit, they'd stopped coming. Family gatherings grew smaller, conversations shorter, until Uncle Ezra became nothing more than a Christmas card signature and occasional mention in passing. Now, looking at the inheritance through adult eyes, Clara understood her father's frustration. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a dirt road that became impassable when it rained. The well worked barely, producing water that tasted of iron and earth. Electricity had been run to the property decades ago, but maintained with the same casual attention Ezra had given to home repair. Daniel emerged from behind the cabin, his jeans dirty and his face bright with the kind of excitement that only 10-year-olds could maintain in the face of obvious hardship. "Mom, you should see what's back there," he called, jogging toward her with something cupped in his hands. "I found arrowheads, and there's a whole garden that's just growing wild now," and he stopped short as he noticed her expression. "Are you okay?" Clara folded the letter and managed to smile. Daniel had inherited his father's ability to find wonder in the simplest things, and his resilience in the face of change had been the one bright spot in their difficult year. Moving here had been as much about giving him space to heal as it had been about escaping the sympathetic looks and careful questions of their old neighborhood. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about Uncle Ezra and wondering what he saw in this old place." Daniel climbed the porch steps, avoiding the ones that looked ready to give way, and settled beside her chair on the rough-hewn boards. He opened his hands to reveal two perfectly preserved arrowheads, their edges still sharp after countless years in the mountain soil. "Maybe he saw what I see," Daniel said with the casual wisdom that sometimes surprised her. "It's not pretty, but it feels like home, like we belong here." The observation hit closer to truth than Clara had expected. Despite the cabin's obvious flaws, something about the place had settled into her bones with surprising comfort. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of their house after Michael died. This was the peaceful silence of a world that had always known how to take care of itself. The mountain air carried scents of pine and wildflowers instead of hospital disinfectant and grief. At night, instead of lying awake calculating bills and worrying about the future, she fell asleep to the sound of wind through the trees and Daniel's easy breathing in the loft bed above her own. "Your father would have liked it here," she said, smoothing Daniel's dark hair. "He always talked about getting out of the city, finding somewhere we could see the stars." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning light creep down the mountainside like honey poured over granite. The view from the porch stretched across a valley dotted with aspens, whose leaves caught the light like scattered coins. In the distance, peaks rose in layers of blue and purple, their snow-capped summits gleaming white against the endless sky. A pickup truck appeared on the dirt road below, kicking up a plume of dust as it wound toward the cabin. Clara recognized the vehicle as belonging to Tom Bradley, Pine Ridge's sheriff, and one of the few locals who'd shown her any kindness since her arrival 2 weeks ago. Tom parked beside Clara's aging sedan and climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of a man in his 50s who'd spent too many years chasing trouble through rough country. His uniform was pressed despite the early hour, his badge polished to a shine that spoke of old-fashioned pride in the job. "Morning, Clara." "Daniel." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you folks are settling in." "As well as can be expected," Clara replied, gesturing toward the cabin with a wry smile. "I'm starting to understand why the realtor wouldn't return my calls." Tom chuckled, a sound like gravel in a mixer. "Ezra's place has been an eyesore for as long as I can remember, but he was good people, even if he kept to himself. Used to buy supplies in town maybe once a month, always paid in cash, never caused trouble for anybody. What did he do for work?" Clara asked. "I mean, how did he live out here all these years?" "That's a good question. He had some kind of pension, I think, and he knew these mountains better than anybody. Used to guide hunters and fishermen back in the day, before his health started failing." Tom studied the cabin with the eye of someone who'd seen plenty of hard luck cases. "Place has good bones, though. Foundation solid, and the wells never run dry. With some work, you could make it comfortable." Daniel perked up at the encouraging words. "Mom's already fixing the porch, and we patched 3 holes in the roof yesterday." "That's fine work," Tom said, his tone carrying genuine approval. "Your uncle would be proud to see family taking care of the place." After Tom left, Clara spent the morning working on the seemingly endless list of repairs the cabin demanded. She replaced rotted boards in the porch floor, caulked gaps around windows, and attacked decades of accumulated grime with determination born of necessity. Physical work had become her refuge when her hands were busy. Her mind couldn't dwell on the magnitude of starting over or the constant worry about money. Daniel proved invaluable as an assistant, his small hands able to reach places she couldn't, and his enthusiasm making even the most tedious tasks feel like adventure. Together, they cleared years of debris from the gutters, discovering a family of mice that had taken up residence and a collection of pine cones that suggested squirrels had been using the roof as a storage facility. By afternoon, they'd made enough progress to justify a break. Clara prepared sandwiches from their meager groceries, while Daniel explored the cabin's interior with the thoroughness of an archaeologist. The main room served as kitchen, dining, and living area, dominated by a stone fireplace that looked like it could heat the entire space if properly maintained. A narrow staircase led to a loft that served as Daniel's bedroom, while Clara slept in what had been Ezra's room, a small space barely large enough for a bed and dresser. "Mom, come look at this," Daniel called from the main room. He was kneeling beside the fireplace, running his fingers along the stone hearth. "These stones are different from the rest." Clara joined him, studying the pattern he'd noticed. 3 stones in the hearth's corner were darker than the others, their surfaces worn smooth, as if they'd been handled frequently. "Uncle Ezra probably used them to prop up pots when he was cooking," she suggested. But even as she spoke, something about the arrangement nagged at her memory. Daniel pressed against one of the stones, and it shifted slightly. "They're loose," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Like they're supposed to move." Clara felt a flutter of the same excitement, remembering Uncle Ezra's stories about hidden treasures and secret passages. As a child, she'd searched every inch of this cabin looking for the mysterious hiding places he'd hinted at in his tales. Now, watching her son make the same discoveries, those memories came flooding back with surprising clarity. Together, they worked the stones free from their mortar bed. Beneath them lay a small cavity lined with metal, a makeshift safe that had been cleverly concealed within the fireplace's construction. Inside the space, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather journal bound with string. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she untied the string and opened the journal's cover. The first page bore an inscription in Ezra's familiar handwriting. For Clara and Daniel, the real treasure was always meant to be shared. The pages that followed contained detailed maps of the surrounding mountains, marked with symbols and notations that meant nothing to Clara, but spoke of years of careful exploration. There were sketches of geological formations, notes about water sources and game trails, and page after page of observations about the land around the cabin. But it was the final entry that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "The claim papers are in the trunk beneath the loose board by the back door. I never had the heart to exploit what I found, but Clara deserves the choice. The silver vein runs deeper than anyone knows, and the legal documentation is solid. She'll need help understanding the technical aspects, but the potential is substantial, more than enough to secure her family's future. I pray she'll use it wisely." EDS March 15th, 2023. Clara looked up to find Daniel watching her with wide eyes, sensing the significance of what they'd discovered, even if he didn't understand the details. "What does it mean, Mom?" "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart. But I think Uncle Ezra left us more than just a cabin." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as Clara read and reread the journal entry, trying to process the implications. A silver claim meant mining rights, which could mean significant money if the vein was substantial. But it also meant complications she wasn't prepared to handle alone. She thought about Tom Bradley's words regarding Ezra's pension and mysterious means of support. Had her uncle been sitting on a fortune all these years, living simply by choice rather than necessity? And if so, why had he waited until now to share that information? Daniel had returned to exploring, his attention now focused on the back of the cabin, where Ezra's journal indicated they might find more answers. Clara followed, journal in hand, feeling as though she was walking through one of her uncle's old stories, made real. The loose board was exactly where the journal indicated, its edges worn smooth from repeated handling. Beneath it lay a metal trunk, its surface black with age, but its hinges still functional. Inside, wrapped in cloth and plastic to protect them from moisture, were documents that would change everything. The silver claim papers were official and comprehensive, bearing stamps and signatures that spoke of legitimate legal standing. There were geological surveys, assay reports showing the quality and quantity of ore in the mountain, and correspondence with mining companies dating back decades. Most significantly, There were recent appraisals suggesting the claim's current value at just over $4 million. Clara sank onto the cabin's back steps, documents scattered around her like leaves from a book of dreams. Daniel sat beside her, sensing his mother's need for quiet while she processed what they'd discovered. The family that everyone in Pine Ridge pitied for, inheriting a worthless shack, had just become wealthy, beyond anything Clara had ever imagined. But with that realization came a flood of questions and concerns that made her head spin. Why had Ezra kept this secret for so long? What were the legal complications of claiming mining rights? How would their lives change once word of this discovery spread through town? And most importantly, what would Michael have wanted her to do with this unexpected gift? As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara made her first decision about their newfound fortune. Tomorrow, she would drive into Denver and find a lawyer who specialized in mining rights. She needed to understand exactly what they'd inherited before she decided what to do with it. But tonight, she would simply hold her son close and be grateful that Uncle Ezra had thought enough of them to leave behind more than memories. Whether this discovery would bring the peace she'd been searching for remained to be seen. But for the first time since Michael's death, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope for the future. Daniel leaned against her shoulder as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, brighter here than they'd ever been in the city. "Do you think Uncle Ezra knew this would happen?" he asked quietly. Clara smiled, remembering her uncle's stories about hidden treasures and the importance of digging deeper than surface appearances. "I think Uncle Ezra knew exactly what he was doing," she said. "And I think he trusted us to figure out what comes next." Clara barely slept that night. The documents lay spread across the cabin's small dining table like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble. Every time she closed her eyes, numbers danced behind her eyelids. $4 million. More money than she'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to secure Daniel's future and erase every financial worry that had kept her awake since Michael's diagnosis. But with the euphoria came fear. She'd heard enough stories about sudden wealth destroying families to know that money could complicate lives as easily as it could improve them. More immediately, she worried about the legal implications of a claim that had apparently been sitting dormant for decades. Daniel woke early, climbing down from his loft bedroom with the quiet movements of a child who'd learned not to disturb his grieving mother's fragile sleep. He found Clara at the table, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by papers covered in technical language and legal terminology that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "Did you stay up all night reading those?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Most of it," Clara admitted, rubbing her tired eyes. "I keep thinking I'll find something that explains why Uncle Ezra never did anything with this claim. According to these surveys, the silver vein is substantial and easily accessible. He could have been wealthy decades ago." Daniel picked up one of the geological reports, studying a cross-section diagram that showed the mountain's interior like a cutaway drawing. Maybe he didn't want to be wealthy. Maybe he liked living simple. The observation was delivered with 10-year-old matter-of-factness, but it carried more wisdom than Clara had managed to extract from hours of document review. She remembered Uncle Ezra's stories about the old mining days, how fortunes made men greedy and greed destroyed communities. Perhaps he'd chosen to leave the silver in the ground, rather than risk becoming something he despised. After a quick breakfast, Clara made 2 phone calls that would change their lives irrevocably. The first was to Margaret Hensley, a Denver attorney whose name appeared in several of the legal documents as having provided consultation on the claim's validity. The second was to Pine Ridge's only bank, requesting an appointment to discuss placing valuable documents in a safe deposit box. Margaret Hensley agreed to meet with Clara that afternoon, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who dealt with mining claims regularly. The banker, however, couldn't hide his curiosity about why the woman everyone assumed was barely scraping by needed secure storage for important papers. The drive to Denver gave Clara time to think about how dramatically Their situation had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been worried about having enough money for groceries and whether the cabin's repairs would drain her meager savings. Today, she was driving to meet with a lawyer about a claim worth millions of dollars. Margaret Hensley's office occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower in downtown Denver, with views of the Rocky Mountains that reminded Clara how far she'd come from the simple cabin that had started this journey. Margaret herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every variation of human nature that money could produce. "I remember your uncle," Margaret said after Clara had explained her situation. "Ezra Duvall was one of the most ethical men I ever met in this business. He came to me about 20 years ago, wanting to make sure his claim was legally sound, but adamant that he had no intention of developing it during his lifetime." She spread Clara's documents across her conference table, reviewing them with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades navigating mining law. "Everything here is legitimate and properly documented," Margaret confirmed. "The claim is registered with both state and federal authorities. All fees have been maintained current, and the geological surveys support the valuation estimates. Your uncle left you something quite valuable, but why didn't he develop it himself?" Clara asked. "According to these reports, the silver could have been extracted with relatively minimal environmental impact." Margaret leaned back in her leather chair, studying Clara with the same careful attention she'd given the documents. "Your uncle was concerned about what mining development would do to the community around Pine Ridge. He'd seen other, small mountain towns transformed by mineral extraction, and not always for the better. He wanted to ensure that if the claim was ever developed, it would be by someone who understood the responsibility that comes with that kind of wealth." The weight of that responsibility settled on Clara's shoulders like a physical presence. This wasn't just about financial security for her family. It was about making decisions that could affect an entire community. "What are my options?" she asked. "You have several paths available," Margaret explained. "You could sell the claim outright to a mining company, which would give you immediate liquidity but no control over how the site is developed. You could lease the mining rights, maintaining ownership while allowing others to extract the silver for a percentage of the profits. Or you could form your own mining operation, though that would require significant capital investment and technical expertise." Clara felt overwhelmed by the complexity of choices she wasn't qualified to make. A week ago, her biggest decision had been whether they could afford to repair the cabin's roof or if they'd have to live with buckets collecting rainwater for another month. "There's something else you should know," Margaret continued. "Word about dormant mining claims travels fast in this industry. I've already received 3 phone calls this morning from companies expressing interest in the Duvall claim. Someone has been monitoring the legal filings and knows you've accessed the documents." The news sent a chill down Clara's spine. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you're going to start receiving offers, probably within the next few days. Some will be legitimate business propositions. Others might involve pressure tactics designed to force you into quick decisions. You need to be prepared for your quiet life in Pine Ridge to become considerably less quiet." On the drive back to the cabin, Clara's mind raced through implications she hadn't considered. The documents were now secure in a Denver safe deposit box, but the knowledge of the claim's existence was apparently spreading through networks she didn't understand. She thought about Daniel, about the peaceful mornings they'd shared on the cabin's porch, and wondered if they were about to lose the simple life she'd hoped to build for them. The sun was setting as she turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. But the tranquil scene was disrupted by an unfamiliar vehicle parked beside Tom Bradley's patrol car. Clara's heart rate quickened as she recognized the signs of trouble. Tom met her at the car, his expression grim. "Clara, we need to talk. These folks have been waiting for you since about 3 o'clock. The folks turned out to be 2 men in expensive suits that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of the weathered cabin. The older man introduced himself as Richard Apex from Apex Mining Corporation, while his younger companion remained silent and watchful. Mrs. Duvall. "I'll get straight to the point," Apex said, his smile carrying the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "We understand you've recently come into possession of a silver claim with considerable potential. We'd like to make you an offer that would allow you to realize that potential immediately, without the complications and risks of development." Clara noticed that Daniel had positioned himself behind Tom Bradley, instinctively recognizing these men as a different kind of visitor than the friendly neighbors who'd stopped by over the past 2 weeks. "I'm still learning about the claim myself," Clara said carefully. "I'm not ready to make any decisions about its future." Of course, Apex replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "These things take time to process. But I want you to understand the realities of mining development, Mrs. Duvall. It's an expensive, risky business that requires expertise you don't possess. Environmental regulations alone can tie up projects for years. Wouldn't it be simpler to accept a generous offer and avoid those headaches entirely?" Tom Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mr. Apex, Mrs. Duvall has made it clear she's not ready to discuss business. Perhaps you should arrange a proper appointment through her attorney rather than showing up unannounced." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara realized she was witnessing her first taste of the pressure Margaret had warned her about. And it was happening faster than either of them had anticipated. "We're prepared to offer $2.5 million. Cash, with closing within 30 days, Apex said, ignoring Tom's suggestion. "That's a substantial amount of money for a single mother trying to raise a son on her own." The offer was staggering, more money than Clara had ever imagined having. But something about Apex's manner, the way he'd researched her personal situation, made her deeply uncomfortable. "I appreciate your interest," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But I won't be making any decisions without proper legal consultation. You can contact my attorney if you'd like to submit a formal proposal." Apex's smile finally faded. "Mrs. Duvall, I hope you'll consider the practical realities of your situation. Mining is a complicated business with many potential pitfalls. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself overwhelmed by forces beyond your control." The barely veiled threat hung in the evening air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Clara felt Daniel move closer to her side, and she placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Apex, I think this conversation is over," Tom Bradley said firmly. "Mrs. Duvall has given you her answer." After the men left, kicking up dust as they drove away too fast down the mountain road, Clara sank onto the porch steps with shaking hands. The peaceful life she'd hoped to build was already slipping away, replaced by complications she didn't understand, and pressures she wasn't equipped to handle. Daniel sat beside her, his young face serious with concerns beyond his years. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Clara pulled him close, breathing in the scent of mountain air and childhood innocence that she was desperate to protect. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But we're going to figure it out together, okay?" As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara realized that Uncle Ezra's gift had come with a price she was only beginning to understand. The question was whether she was strong enough to pay it. Word of the Apex mining visit spread through Pine Ridge faster than Clara had thought possible in a town where the nearest neighbor lived miles away. By the next morning, 3 different locals had found reasons to drive past the cabin, their curiosity barely concealed behind offers of help with repairs or invitations to church socials. Clara was replacing a section of rotted porch railing when Martha Webb from the general store arrived with a casserole and an abundance of questions disguised as neighborly concern. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday," Martha said, settling the covered dish on the porch with the air of someone prepared for a long conversation. "City folks in expensive suits don't usually make social calls up this way. Just business people," Clara replied carefully, not wanting to fuel the gossip mill, but recognizing the futility of trying to keep secrets in a small mountain community. Martha's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of business would those folks have with Ezra's old place? No offense, dear, but there's not much here that would interest corporate types. Before Clara could formulate a diplomatically vague response, Tom Bradley's patrol car appeared on the road below. She felt a wave of relief at the interruption, even though Tom's expression suggested he wasn't bringing good news. "Morning, Martha," Tom said as he climbed the porch steps. "Clara, I was hoping we could talk privately for a few minutes." Martha took the hint with obvious reluctance, gathering her casserole and promising to check on them later. After her departure, Tom settled into the chair Clara had started thinking of as his during his increasingly frequent visits. "I ran those license plates from yesterday," he began. "Richard Apex is exactly who he claims to be. Executive Vice President of Apex Mining, one of the largest extraction companies in the Rocky Mountain region. But his companion's background is more interesting. Name's Vincent Kowalski, and he's got a history of what the industry calls acquisition consulting." What does that mean? It means he specializes in convincing reluctant property owners to sell mineral rights, sometimes using methods that go beyond standard business practices. He's been investigated twice by federal authorities, but never charged with anything. Clara felt the same chill she'd experienced during yesterday's confrontation. "Are you saying they might try to force us off the property?" "I'm saying you should be careful," Tom replied. "And I want you to know that Pine Ridge takes care of its own. You're not facing this alone." His words carried the weight of genuine commitment, and Clara realized she'd found an unexpected ally in the sheriff, who'd made it his business to look after the town's newest residents. "There's something else," Tom continued. "I've been thinking about your Uncle Ezra, and some things that never quite added up about his situation. Man lived like he didn't have two nickels to rub together, but he paid his property taxes in cash every year and never seemed to worry about money for necessities. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting Ezra might have been sitting on more than just knowledge of a silver claim. And if that's true, there might be other people who've been watching this property for longer than either of us realized." The implications of Tom's theory sent Clara's mind racing. If Uncle Ezra had been secretly wealthy while living simply by choice, it meant the cabin and surrounding land might have been under surveillance for years. It also raised questions about why he'd chosen to reveal the truth now. Through her inheritance, Daniel emerged from behind the cabin carrying Uncle Ezra's surveying equipment, which he'd discovered in a shed that was better constructed and better maintained than the cabin itself. The transit and measuring tools were professional grade, far more expensive than anything a simple mountain hermit should have owned. "Mom, look at this stuff," Daniel said, setting down a leather case filled with precision instruments. "It's like Uncle Ezra was some kind of engineer or scientist." Tom examined the equipment with growing interest. "This is high-end geological surveying gear, probably worth $20,000 new." "Your uncle wasn't just aware of the silver. He claimed he was actively mapping it." Clara opened the case and found detailed topographical maps marked with symbols and notations that corresponded to the documents they'd discovered. One map showed the silver vein in relation to the cabin's location, revealing that Uncle Ezra had positioned his home with strategic precision. "He built the cabin here on purpose," she realized. "He chose this exact spot because it gives access to the claim while appearing to be just a random homestead. Which means," Tom added grimly, "anyone watching the property would know there was something valuable here, even if they didn't know exactly what." The revelation transformed Clara's understanding of their situation. They weren't just dealing with a mining company that had recently learned about a dormant claim. They were potentially facing people who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to acquire whatever Uncle Ezra had been protecting. That afternoon brought their first taste of how quickly their changed circumstances would affect daily life. Clara had driven to Pine Ridge for groceries, leaving Daniel with strict instructions to stay close to the cabin and alert Tom immediately if any strangers appeared. At Morrison's Market, the town's combination grocery store and social hub, Clara found herself the center of attention in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. Conversation stopped when she entered aisles, resuming in hushed tones after she passed. The checkout clerk, usually chatty and friendly, seemed nervous and distracted. "You doing okay up there at Ezra's place?" asked Bill Morrison, the store's owner, as he rang up her purchases. "Heard you've been getting some interesting visitors." "We're managing fine," Clara replied. But she could feel the weight of curious stares from other customers. "Well, you let folks know if you need anything," Bill said, his tone carrying undertones she couldn't quite interpret. "Small communities like ours, we look out for each other, but sometimes that means being careful about outside influences that might not have the community's best interests at heart." Clara left the store feeling more isolated than she had since arriving in Pine Ridge. The message seemed clear. Her newfound wealth, or the potential for it, was already changing how people perceived her. She was no longer just another struggling widow trying to make a fresh start. She was someone with resources that could affect the entire community. For better or worse, the drive back to the cabin gave her time to process the morning's revelations. Uncle Ezra hadn't just left her a silver claim. He'd left her a complex legacy that involved years of careful planning and protection. The surveying equipment suggested he'd spent decades mapping and documenting the claim, ensuring that when the time came to transfer ownership, everything would be legally sound and technically accurate. But why had he waited so long? And why choose her rather than her father or another family member who might have been better equipped to handle the responsibilities involved? Daniel was waiting on the porch when she returned, his face bright with excitement about a new discovery. He led her to the cabin's small root cellar, a space she'd barely examined during their initial exploration. "I was looking for more arrowheads," he explained, "and I noticed these scratches on the wall. They're not random. They look like letters or numbers." Clara studied the marks Daniel had found, carved into the wooden walls with careful precision. They appeared to be coordinates or survey markers, corresponding to locations marked on Uncle Ezra's maps. He was documenting everything, she realized. Not just the silver claim, but the entire area. These markings probably correspond to specific geological features or boundary markers. As they compared the cellar inscriptions to Uncle Ezra's maps, a clearer picture emerged of the inheritance they'd received. This wasn't just about mineral rights. It was about comprehensive knowledge of the mountain's resources, accumulated over decades of careful study. But with that knowledge came the growing realization that they were probably not the only ones aware of its value. If Apex Mining had tracked them down within hours of accessing the legal documents, other interested parties couldn't be far behind. Clara looked at her son, who was studying Uncle Ezra's maps with the intense concentration he'd inherited from his father, and felt the weight of decisions that would shape both their futures. The simple life she'd hoped to build was already slipping away, replaced by complexities she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. But one thing was becoming clear. Uncle Ezra had trusted her with this legacy for reasons she was only beginning to understand. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she was determined to prove worthy of that trust. Margaret Hensley's office felt like a sanctuary when Clara returned 3 days later, this time with Daniel in tow and a briefcase full of questions that had multiplied faster than she could find answers for them. The attorney listened with growing concern as Clara described the Apex Mining visit, Tom Bradley's warnings, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in how Pine Ridge residents treated her. "I've been practicing mining law for 30 years, Margaret said, reviewing the additional documents Clara had discovered. "Your uncle's work is the most comprehensive claim documentation I've ever seen. These surveys and geological assessments are worth more than the silver itself. They represent decades of professional-grade research." She spread a collection of photographs across her desk, images Daniel had found in a tin box beneath the cabin's floorboards. The pictures showed Uncle Ezra with teams of surveyors and mining engineers, all wearing the hard hats and serious expressions of people engaged in significant work. "Your uncle wasn't a hermit who stumbled onto a silver vein," Margaret continued. He was a respected geological engineer who spent his career mapping mineral resources throughout the Rocky Mountain region. According to these employment records, he worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for 25 years before retiring to pursue private consulting. The revelation recontextualized everything Clara thought she knew about her uncle. The man her father had dismissed as a dreamer and failure had actually been a highly skilled professional who'd chosen simplicity over the complications that came with exploiting his knowledge. But why did he keep the claim dormant for so long? Clara asked. Margaret pointed to a folder marked with dates spanning the past 2 decades. Because he was fighting a legal battle that most people didn't know existed. 3 different companies have attempted to claim parts of your uncle's territory through various technicalities and loopholes. He spent thousands of dollars and countless hours defending his rights through the courts. Daniel, who'd been quietly studying the photographs, looked up with sudden understanding. He was protecting it, like a treasure guardian in one of those adventure movies. That's exactly what he was doing, Margaret agreed. And according to these legal files, the last challenge to his claim was resolved only 6 months ago. That's probably why he felt comfortable. Transferring ownership to you, he'd finally secured clear title to the entire property. The timing explained why Uncle Ezra had reached out through his will. Rather than during his lifetime, he'd wanted to ensure Clara inherited a clean, legally sound claim, rather than an ongoing legal battle she wouldn't have been equipped to handle. What's our position now? Clara asked. Are we likely to face similar challenges? The legal standing is solid, Margaret assured her. But you're going to face a different kind of pressure. Word is spreading through the mining industry that the Duvall claim is potentially available. And that's attracting attention from some very large players. As if to emphasize her point, Margaret's secretary knocked and entered with a message slip. Excuse me, but you have 3 more calls from mining companies requesting information about the Duvall property. And there's a Mr. Morrison from Pine Ridge holding on line 2. He says it's urgent. Clara felt her stomach tighten as Margaret took the call. Bill Morrison's voice was loud enough to hear clearly, even from across the desk. Margaret, you need to warn Mrs. Duvall that she's got company coming whether she wants it or not. There's been surveyors crawling all over the public land adjacent to Ezra's property, and folks in town are asking questions about mineral rights that make me nervous. After Margaret hung up, she studied Clara with the expression of someone delivering difficult news. It appears that other companies are exploring options for accessing your claim through adjacent properties. Even though they can't touch your uncle's land directly, they might be looking for ways to approach the silver vein from different angles. The possibility hadn't occurred to Clara, but it made sense from a business perspective. If the silver deposit extended beyond Uncle Ezra's property boundaries, other companies might be able to access portions of it through their own claims or leases. What does that mean for us? It means your leverage is diminishing with each passing day. Right now you control the primary access point and the most comprehensive geological data. But if competitors establish their own access routes and conduct their own surveys, your claim becomes less valuable and less strategically important. Clara felt the weight of decisions pressing down on her like a physical force. Every option seemed to carry risks she didn't fully understand, while the window for making informed choices appeared to be closing rapidly. I need to ask you something difficult, Margaret said gently. Have you considered that your uncle might have had specific expectations about what you'd do with this inheritance? His choice to leave everything to you, rather than to other family members or to charity, suggests he believed you were the right person for whatever he had in mind. The question struck at the heart of Clara's uncertainty. She'd been thinking about the claim primarily in terms of financial security for Daniel's future, but Uncle Ezra's careful planning suggested he'd envisioned something more complex than a simple sale. Daniel had been studying one of the photographs with intense concentration, and now he looked up with the kind of insight that sometimes surprised Clara with its maturity. Mom, look at this picture. Uncle Ezra is standing with all these other people, but he's the only one not smiling. Everyone else looks excited, but he looks worried. Clara examined the image Daniel had noticed. It showed Uncle Ezra with what appeared to be a mining crew, taken sometime in the 1990s, based on the clothing and equipment visible, while the other men displayed the enthusiasm of people anticipating profit. Ezra's expression carried concern that bordered on sadness. I think he saw what mining did to places and people. Daniel continued with 10-year-old directness. And maybe he didn't want that to happen to our mountain, Margaret nodded approvingly. Your son may have identified your uncle's primary concern. Environmental impact and community disruption are significant considerations in mining development. Your uncle probably wanted the claim to go to someone who would weigh those factors against purely economic considerations. The observation forced Clara to confront questions she'd been avoiding. Did she have the right to make decisions that could fundamentally alter Pine Ridge and the surrounding wilderness? Was financial security for her family worth potential environmental damage and community disruption? There is another option we haven't discussed, Margaret said carefully. You could establish a trust or foundation that would manage the claim's development according to specific environmental and community guidelines. It would be more complex than an outright sale, but it would give you control over how the resources are extracted and how the profits are used. The suggestion opened possibilities Clara hadn't considered. Instead of choosing between exploitation and preservation, she could potentially find a middle path that honored both Uncle Ezra's concerns and her family's needs. But even as the option appealed to her sense of responsibility, Clara recognized the complexity it would involve. Managing a mining trust would require expertise she didn't possess and decisions she wasn't qualified to make alone. I need time to think about this, she said finally. And I need to understand better what Uncle Ezra really intended when he left me this inheritance. Margaret gathered the documents with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. Take the time you need, but don't take too long. The mining industry doesn't wait for anyone to make up their mind, and the longer you delay, the more pressure you're likely to face from people who have their own ideas about what should happen to that silver. On the drive back to Pine Ridge, Clara found herself looking at the mountain landscape with new eyes. Each ridge and valley represented not just natural beauty, but geological complexity that could be transformed by mining equipment and industrial development. The responsibility Uncle Ezra had placed on her shoulders felt heavier with each passing mile. Daniel had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, his face peaceful in the way that only children could manage, despite uncertainty surrounding their future. Clara made a silent promise that whatever decisions lay ahead, she would make them with his best interests at heart, while trying to honor the trust Uncle Ezra had placed in her judgment. The cabin appeared around the final bend in the road, its weathered walls and sagging roof no longer symbols of poverty, but of a man who'd chosen to live simply while protecting something he considered more valuable than personal wealth. Clara parked beside Tom Bradley's patrol car, grateful once again for his reliable presence during these uncertain days. But as she woke Daniel and gathered their things, she couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet period of adjustment was coming to an end. The forces Margaret had warned about were gathering strength, and soon Clara would have to choose not just what to do with Uncle Ezra's legacy, but who she wanted to become in the process of protecting it. The coded journal lay open on Clara's kitchen table like a puzzle demanding to be solved. She'd discovered it 2 days earlier, hidden within the false bottom of Uncle Ezra's desk drawer, a leather-bound notebook filled with entries written in a cipher that mixed numbers, symbols, and abbreviated words into an indecipherable maze. Daniel sat across from her, his school notebooks pushed aside in favor of the more intriguing challenge of cracking his great-uncle's mysterious code. For the past hour, they'd been trying different approaches, treating numbers as letters, looking for pattern repetitions, even holding pages up to the mirror in case Ezra had written backwards. "Try this one, Mom," Daniel said, pointing to an entry from 3 months before Ezra's death. "See how he uses the same symbol 3 times in this line? And look, It appears in the same position in two other entries from around the same time. Clara studied the pattern Daniel had identified. Her son had inherited his father's analytical mind and was approaching the code with systematic patience that reminded her painfully of Michael working through complex engineering problems. "You might be onto something," she said, copying the symbol onto a separate sheet. "If we assume this represents a name or place that would appear regularly in his notes," a knock at the front door interrupted their work. Through the window, Clara saw a man she didn't recognize standing on the porch, middle-aged, wearing work clothes that had seen recent use, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Mrs. Duvall? My name's Jake Morrison. I was a friend of your uncle's and I think we need to talk." Something in his tone made Clara's instincts sharpen. "How do I know you actually knew Uncle Ezra?" Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "He used to say that trust was like mountain water. It had to be earned one drop at a time. And he always kept a flask of Irish whiskey hidden behind the loose stone in his fireplace. Even though he hardly ever drank it, the detail was specific enough to suggest genuine familiarity with Uncle Ezra's habits." Clara unlatched the chain and stepped aside to let him enter. Though she remained alert for any sign of deception, Jake's eyes immediately went to the coded journal on the table, and his expression grew grave. "He's got you working on the cipher, doesn't he? Ezra always said that when the time came, the right person would be able to figure out what he really wanted them to know." "You can read this?" Daniel asked excitedly. "Some of it," Jake admitted. "Your uncle and I developed the code together back when we were both working claims that attracted the wrong kind of attention. But Ezra added elements over the years that I'm not familiar with." Clara gestured for him to sit down, her curiosity overriding her caution. "What kind of wrong attention?" Jake studied her face as if trying to decide how much truth she could handle. "The kind that comes when you discover something valuable that other people have been looking for. Your uncle wasn't the only one who knew about the silver vein. Mrs. Duvall, he was just the only one who managed to secure legal claim to it." The revelation sent a chill through Clara. "Are you saying other people have been searching for the same deposit?" "For over 20 years, Jake confirmed. "There's been rumors about a major silver strike in these mountains since the early 2000s. Geological surveys, mineral assays, even some illegal prospecting on federal land. But nobody could pinpoint the exact location until your uncle's work confirmed it." Daniel leaned forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Were you a miner too?" Jake's laugh carried more sadness than humor. "I was a lot of things, son. Mostly, I was the kind of person who made bad decisions for good reasons. Your uncle tried to keep me on the straight path, but I wasn't always smart enough to listen." Clara sensed layers of history in Jake's words that would take time to unpack. "Why are you here now? What do you want from us?" "I want to make sure you understand what you're dealing with," Jake said seriously. "The people who've been hunting for this claim aren't the type to give up just because the legal ownership is clear. They've invested too much time and money to walk away empty-handed." As if to underscore his warning, the sound of vehicles on the mountain road drew their attention. Through the window, Clara saw 2 trucks approaching the cabin, moving faster than was safe on the narrow dirt track. "Expecting company?" Jake asked, his casual tone not matching the tension in his posture. "No," Clara said, moving to position herself between the window and Daniel. The trucks pulled up beside the cabin, with the kind of aggressive parking that suggested their occupants weren't planning a social visit. 4 men climbed out, all wearing work clothes, and expressions that made Clara's stomach tighten with apprehension. Jake moved to the window and cursed quietly. "Mrs. Duvall, I need you to take Daniel upstairs and stay there until I tell you it's safe." "Who are they?" "People who work for someone who's been waiting a long time to get his hands on your uncle's claim. And they're not here to make polite conversation." Clara grabbed Daniel's hand and headed toward the stairs, but her son resisted. "Mom, we can't leave Mr. Morrison alone." "Yes, we can," Clara said firmly, her maternal instincts overriding her curiosity. "Upstairs now. From the loft window, Clara and Daniel watched as Jake stepped onto the porch to meet the four men. The conversation was too quiet to hear clearly, but the body language told a story of tension and barely contained aggression. The apparent leader of the group was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. He gestured toward the cabin and then toward the mountains beyond, as if he was discussing property he already owned. Jake's responses were brief, his hands held carefully away from his sides in the universal gesture of someone trying to de-escalate a dangerous situation. But Clara could see the rigid set of his shoulders and knew he was preparing for trouble. "Mom, should we call Sheriff Bradley?" Daniel whispered. Clara was already reaching for her phone when she realized the conversation below had shifted. Jake was nodding and pointing toward the road, as if agreeing to something. The group of men climbed back into their trucks and drove away, but their departure felt more like a temporary retreat than a resolution. Jake remained on the porch until the sound of engines faded completely, then called up to them. "It's okay to come down now." Clara and Daniel descended the stairs to find Jake sitting heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, looking older than he had when he'd arrived. "What did they want?" Clara asked. "They wanted to deliver a message," Jake said grimly. "Their employer is prepared to make you an offer that's significantly higher than what Apex Mining proposed." But the implication was clear. This isn't really a negotiation. Who is their employer? Jake hesitated, as if speaking the name would make the threat more real. Vincent Kowalski runs a company called Mountain Resource Development. On paper, they're a legitimate mining operation. In practice, they specialize in acquiring claims through whatever methods prove necessary. Clara remembered Tom Bradley's warning about Kowalski, the man who'd accompanied Richard Apex during their visit. The sheriff said he was investigated by federal authorities. Investigated but never prosecuted, Jake confirmed. Kowalski's smart enough to keep his methods just inside the bounds of legal, even when they cross every ethical line you can imagine. Daniel had been studying the coded journal during their conversation, and now he looked up with sudden excitement. "I think I figured out part of the code. Look at this entry from last month." He pointed to a series of symbols that Jake immediately recognized. "That's a warning notation," Jake said, his voice tight with concern. "Ezra used that combination when he wanted to document threats or dangerous situations." Clara felt the walls of their simple mountain life closing in around them. "What kind of threats?" Jake translated the coded entry with growing unease. "Surveillance confirmed. Vehicle parked on County Road 247 for 3 consecutive days. Occupants using telephoto camera equipment. Recommend increased security precautions." The revelation that Uncle Ezra had been under surveillance before his death transformed their understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about a recently discovered mining claim. It was about a years-long campaign to acquire resources that multiple parties considered valuable enough to justify extreme measures. "How long has this been going on?" Clara asked. "According to these entries, at least 2 years, Jake said, flipping through pages of coded warnings. "Your uncle documented license plates, photographed suspicious individuals, even recorded conversations when he could manage it safely." Daniel found another entry and worked to decode it using the pattern they'd identified. "Jake, what does this mean?" "Package secured in location 7. Retrieval instructions with MH. Trust no one else." Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "MH would be Margaret Hensley, your attorney. And location 7. He looked around the cabin with new understanding. "Your uncle had multiple hiding places for important items. We've only found a few of them." The possibility that Uncle Ezra had hidden additional documents or evidence throughout the property sent Clara's mind racing. If he'd been systematically documenting threats and surveillance, those records could be crucial for understanding the full scope of what they were dealing with, but the growing complexity of their situation also meant that Clara was being forced to make decisions with far-reaching consequences based on information she was still struggling to understand. The simple choice between selling the claim and keeping it had evolved into a complex web of legal, environmental, and personal safety considerations that seemed to grow more tangled with each new revelation. Jake stood and moved toward the door, his expression suggesting he'd said more than he'd originally intended. "Mrs. Duvall, I need you to be very careful about who you trust and what information you share. Your uncle spent years building safeguards to protect this claim and the people who might inherit it. Don't let his work be wasted by making decisions too quickly." After he left, Clara and Daniel returned to the coded journal with renewed purpose. If Uncle Ezra had left them clues about how to navigate the dangerous waters they'd found themselves in, they needed to find and understand those clues before circumstances forced their hand. But even as they worked to decode more of the mysterious entries, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time in a competition where the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined, and where the other players had been preparing. For years, while she was just learning the rules, the hidden room beneath the cabin revealed itself almost by accident. Daniel had been chasing a ball that rolled behind the old water heater when he noticed that his voice echoed differently in one corner of the basement. Clara might have dismissed it as childhood imagination, if not for the systematic way Uncle Ezra had documented everything else about the property. Working together, they discovered that what appeared to be a solid stone foundation wall was actually a carefully constructed facade. 3 stones, when pressed in the correct sequence, released a mechanism that swung open a section of the wall like a door. The room beyond took Clara's breath away. Uncle Ezra had created a professional cartographer's dream workspace in the hidden chamber. The walls were covered with detailed topographical maps, geological surveys, and mining charts that showed the mountain's interior with scientific precision. A drafting table held instruments Clara recognized from engineering textbooks, precision compasses, measuring tools, and surveying equipment that represented thousands of dollars in professional gear. But most significantly, the room contained evidence that Uncle Ezra hadn't been working alone. "Mom, look at this," Daniel said, pointing to a photograph pinned to one of the maps. It showed Uncle Ezra with Jake Morrison and a woman Clara didn't recognize, all 3 standing beside surveying equipment with expressions of serious purpose. Clara studied the image more carefully. The woman appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that suggested professional expertise. Something about her seemed familiar, though Clara couldn't place where she might have seen her before. A filing cabinet in the room's corner contained folders labeled with dates spanning the past 2 decades. Clara opened the most recent folder and found documentation that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The files contained photographs of the men who had visited their cabin yesterday, along with detailed background information about mountain resource development and its business practices. Uncle Ezra had been conducting his own investigation into the people who were interested in his claim, and what he discovered was deeply troubling. Vincent Kowalski's company had a history of acquiring mining rights through what the documents euphemistically called aggressive negotiation tactics. Property owners who refused initial offers often found themselves facing financial pressure, legal challenges, or problems with local authorities. In several cases, families had been forced to sell their land at far below market value after experiencing a series of unfortunate coincidences that made their lives unbearable. He was building a case against them, Clara realized, flipping through pages of documented incidents. Uncle Ezra was collecting evidence of illegal practices. Daniel had found another folder marked with Margaret Hensley's initials, and inside it were documents that provided crucial context for their attorney's involvement in the situation. Margaret wasn't just a mining law specialist. She was a former federal investigator who had spent years tracking corporate corruption in the extractive industries. Her collaboration with Uncle Ezra had been part of a larger effort to document and expose illegal practices that federal authorities had struggled to prosecute due to lack of concrete evidence. A knock at the cabin door interrupted their exploration of the hidden room. Clara's heart rate spiked as she realized they'd lost track of time while examining Uncle Ezra's files. But when she peered through the window, she saw a woman with silver hair standing on the porch, the same woman from the photograph they'd just discovered. Clara climbed the basement stairs and opened the door to find herself face to face with Margaret Hensley, though the attorney looked far more casual than she had in her Denver office. She wore hiking boots and outdoor clothing that suggested she'd driven directly from the city to the mountains. "Mrs. Duvall, I hope you don't mind my arriving unannounced, but we need to talk about some developments that can't wait for scheduled appointments." Clara invited Margaret inside, noting how the attorney's eyes immediately went to the open basement door and the evidence of their recent exploration. "You found Ezra's documentation room," Margaret observed with approval. "Good. That means you're beginning to understand the full scope of what you've inherited." Daniel emerged from the basement, carrying one of the folders, his face bright with the excitement of discovery. "Ms. Hensley, are you the federal investigator in Uncle Ezra's pictures?" Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her usually serious features. "I was before I retired and started practicing law. Your uncle and I worked together on cases involving mining industry corruption. He was one of the most dedicated citizen investigators I ever encountered." Clara gestured toward the kitchen table, where Uncle Ezra's coded journal still lay open beside their decoding efforts. "We're starting to realize that Uncle Ezra left us more than just a silver claim. He left us evidence of criminal activity. Extensive evidence," Margaret confirmed. "The files in that room represent years of careful documentation. Phone conversations, financial records, photographs of illegal surveillance, and witness statements from property owners who were pressured to sell their mineral rights below market value. Why didn't he take this to authorities while he was alive?" Margaret's expression grew somber. "He tried. But Vincent Kowalski and his associates are very skilled at operating just inside the boundaries of legal behavior. Individual incidents could be explained away as coincidence or overly aggressive, but legitimate business practices. What Ezra was trying to build was a pattern of behavior that would demonstrate systematic illegal activity." Daniel looked up from the folder he'd been examining. "So Uncle Ezra was like an undercover detective?" "In many ways, yes," Margaret agreed. "And now that evidence belongs to you, which means you have choices to make about how to use it." Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Uncle Ezra hadn't just left her a fortune in silver, he'd left her the power to expose corruption that had been affecting mountain communities throughout the region. "What happens if we take this evidence public?" she asked. "Federal prosecutors would finally have the comprehensive documentation they need to build a case against mountain resource development," Margaret explained. "But it would also put you and Daniel at considerable personal risk. These people have demonstrated willingness to use intimidation and pressure tactics against anyone who threatens their operations." The choice crystallized with stark clarity. Clara could sell the silver claim and walk away with enough money to secure Daniel's future. Or she could honor Uncle Ezra's deeper purpose by helping to expose the corruption he'd spent years documenting. But the second path would mean accepting risks she wasn't sure she had the right to impose on her son. Margaret seemed to understand her internal struggle. "Ezra knew this decision would eventually fall to you. That's why he spent so much time ensuring you'd have all the information necessary to make an informed choice. But the choice itself, that has to be yours." As if summoned by their conversation about risk, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the window, Clara saw Tom Bradley's patrol car, followed by two other vehicles she didn't recognize. Tom climbed the porch steps with the purposeful stride of someone bringing official business. "Clara, Margaret, glad you're both here. We've got a situation developing that you need to know about." The situation proved to be more serious than Clara had anticipated. Federal agents from the Bureau of Land Management had arrived in Pine Ridge with search warrants related to illegal mineral extraction on public lands adjacent to Uncle Ezra's property. Their investigation had uncovered evidence of unauthorized mining activity that appeared to be connected to mountain resource. Development's efforts to access the silver vein through alternative means. They've been conducting illegal test drilling on federal land, Tom explained. And according to the agents, they found equipment and documentation that ties directly to the files in Ezra's hidden room. Clara realized that Uncle Ezra's death had triggered a series of events that were larger than his individual claim. The evidence he'd been collecting was now part of a federal investigation that could affect mining operations throughout the Rocky Mountain region. But with that realization came the understanding that her family was no longer just potential targets for corporate pressure. They were key witnesses in a federal case that powerful people had strong incentives to prevent from reaching prosecution. Margaret gathered the files they'd been reviewing with the efficiency of someone accustomed to protecting important evidence. Clara, Daniel, it's time to make some decisions about how much risk you're willing to accept in the name of justice. Because after today, staying neutral is no longer an option. As Clara looked at her son, who was following the adult conversation with the intense attention of someone trying to understand forces beyond his experience, she realized that Uncle Ezra's true inheritance wasn't wealth or property. It was the opportunity to choose between safety and courage in the face of injustice. The question was whether she possessed the strength to make the choice he'd trusted her to make. The video message changed everything Clara thought she understood about her inheritance, her uncle, and herself. She'd found the hidden laptop purely by chance, tucked behind a loose panel in Uncle Ezra's bedroom closet, while searching for additional documents the federal agents had requested. The computer was password protected, but Daniel's suggestion to try her birthday information Uncle Ezra would have known from family records granted them access to files that painted a far more complex picture of her uncle's activities than anything they'd discovered so far. The most recent video file was dated just 2 weeks before Uncle Ezra's death. In it, he sat at the desk in his hidden map room, looking directly into the camera with the expression of a man preparing to confess something that had weighed on his conscience for decades. "Clara," his recorded voice began, "if you're watching this, then you found my documentation, and you're probably struggling with decisions I should have made years ago. But before you decide what to do with the evidence I've left you, there's something you need to know about how I acquired the information that makes this claim so valuable." Clara felt Daniel tense beside her as Uncle Ezra's image continued speaking. "From beyond the grave, the original geological surveys that identified the silver deposit weren't conducted by me or my team. They were stolen from Apex Mining Corporation during a corporate espionage operation that I participated in 35 years ago." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her uncle, the man she'd been learning to admire for his integrity and dedication to justice, was confessing to corporate theft on a scale that could invalidate everything they'd inherited. "I was working for a competing company at the time," Uncle Ezra continued, his recorded voice heavy with regret. "Our job was to identify mineral resources that Apex had discovered but hadn't yet developed. We broke into their Denver offices and copied their geological database, including surveys they'd conducted throughout the Rocky Mountain region." Daniel looked at Clara with confusion and growing concern. "Mom, what does this mean for us?" Clara couldn't answer immediately. She was trying to process the legal and ethical implications of Uncle Ezra's revelation while fighting off waves of betrayal and disappointment. The man who'd left them what seemed like a legitimate inheritance had built it on stolen information. Uncle Ezra's confession continued with details that made the situation increasingly complex. "The company I was working for collapsed within 2 years, and the stolen data ended up in legal limbo. But I kept copies of the surveys, and I used that information to identify and file claims on properties that Apex had marked as promising, but hadn't yet secured." The video showed Uncle Ezra pulling out a folder Clara recognized from their exploration of the hidden room. Everything I've done for the past 3 decades, the legal battles, the documentation of corporate corruption, even the investigation into mountain resource development, it all started with information that wasn't rightfully mine to possess. Clara felt the foundation of her moral certainty crumbling. If Uncle Ezra's claim was based on stolen data, did that make her family accomplices to corporate theft? Did it invalidate their ownership of the silver deposit? And most troublingly, did it mean that Vincent Kowalski and his associates might actually have legitimate grievances against the Duvall family? But Uncle Ezra wasn't finished with his revelations. The reason mountain resource development has been so persistent in pursuing this claim isn't just because of its value, he said, his expression growing grimmer. It's because Vincent Kowalski was the person who hired me to steal that information 35 years ago. The twist was so unexpected that Clara had to replay the statement mentally to be sure she'd heard it correctly. Kowalski wasn't just a corrupt mining executive trying to acquire their property. He was Uncle Ezra's former employer in the original theft that had started everything. Kowalski knows the claim is based on stolen data because he ordered the theft himself, Uncle Ezra continued. But he can't expose that fact without implicating himself in the original crime. That's why he's been using pressure tactics. Instead of legal challenges, he can't afford to bring this case into federal court where the origins of the geological data might be examined. Daniel was following the explanation with the focused attention he gave to complex puzzles, and now he looked up with sudden understanding. So Mr. Kowalski can't prove the claim is illegal without admitting he's a criminal too. Exactly, Clara said, beginning to grasp the strategic complexity of their situation. Uncle Ezra created a stalemate where neither side could use legal channels without exposing their own wrongdoing. But the video contained one more revelation that would force Clara to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the choice she faced. The geological surveys Kowalski hired me to steal weren't just about mineral resources, Uncle Ezra said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Apex Mining had discovered evidence that the silver deposit extends beneath a significant portion of the surrounding national forest. Extracting it using conventional mining methods would require massive environmental destruction, clear-cutting thousands of acres and contaminating water sources that serve multiple communities. Clara felt her breath catch as the full implications of this information became clear. The silver wasn't just valuable because of its monetary worth, it was environmentally dangerous because of where it was located and how it would need to be extracted. Apex abandoned the project when they realized the environmental costs would outweigh the profits, Uncle Ezra continued. But other companies, including Kowalski's operation, have been waiting for an opportunity to acquire the mineral rights and develop the deposit using cheaper, more destructive methods. The video showed Uncle Ezra holding up photographs of mining operations Clara recognized from environmental disaster documentaries, scarred landscapes where mountains had been literally moved to access mineral deposits, leaving behind toxic waste and destroyed ecosystems. That's what they want to do to our mountain, Uncle Ezra said quietly. And the stolen surveys give them the technical information they need to make it profitable, even with the environmental destruction it would cause. Clara realized that Uncle Ezra hadn't just left her a choice between wealth and justice. He'd left her a choice between personal gain and environmental catastrophe on a scale that could affect the entire region. I spent 30 years trying to atone for my participation in that original theft, Uncle Ezra said as his recorded confession neared its end. I documented Kowalski's illegal activities, protected the claim from development, and gathered evidence that could expose the whole corrupt system. But I couldn't bring myself to confess the truth about how it all started. His image leaned closer to the camera, and Clara could see the weight of decades of guilt in his eyes. Now that burden falls to you, Clara. You can sell the claim and walk away wealthy, but you'll be handing over information that will be used to destroy thousands of acres of wilderness. You can keep the claim and try to develop it responsibly, but you'll be profiting from stolen information. Or you can expose the truth about everything, the original theft, Kowalski's corruption, and the environmental dangers, knowing that it might cost you the financial security I wanted to provide for your family. The video ended with Uncle Ezra looking directly into the camera with an expression of profound sadness and hope. I chose you to inherit this burden because I believe you're strong enough to make the choice I wasn't brave enough to make myself. Whatever you decide, I trust your judgment, and I'm proud to call you family. The screen went black, leaving Clara and Daniel sitting in silence while they processed the magnitude of what they'd just learned. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, having entered the cabin so quietly that neither Clara nor Daniel had heard him arrive. His expression suggested he'd been expecting this moment. "You found Ezra's confession," he said quietly. "I was wondering when he would have programmed it to surface." Clara looked at him with new understanding. "You knew about the stolen surveys. I was part of the original theft," Jake admitted, with the weariness of someone who'd carried the secret for decades. "Kowalski hired both Ezra and me for that operation. The difference is I never developed the conscience that made Ezra spend the rest of his life trying to make amends." Daniel looked between the adults with the confusion of someone trying to understand moral complexities beyond his experience. "So everybody did bad things, but Uncle Ezra tried to fix them." "That's a pretty good summary," Jake said with a sad smile. "And now your mother has to decide whether she's going to continue fixing them or walk away and let someone else deal with the consequences." Clara realized that every assumption she'd made about her inheritance had been wrong. This wasn't a story about a simple widow discovering unexpected wealth. It was a story about inherited guilt, environmental responsibility, and the courage required to confront decades of accumulated wrongs. The silver claim wasn't just worth $4 million. It was the key to exposing corporate corruption, preventing environmental disaster, and finally, bringing justice to communities that had been exploited for decades. But claiming that moral authority would require Clara to risk everything she'd hoped to build for her family's future, while accepting the weight of decisions that would affect thousands of people she'd never met. As she looked at her son, who was watching her with absolute trust in her ability to make the right choice, Clara realized that Uncle Ezra's true inheritance wasn't wealth or property. It was the opportunity to choose who she wanted to become when confronted with the full complexity of truth. The federal evidence cache hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards contained documents that would reshape Clara's understanding of corporate corruption in the American West. She knelt beside the metal filing box with Daniel and Jake Morrison, carefully removing folders that Uncle Ezra had labeled with the methodical precision of someone building a case that could withstand federal scrutiny. "Your uncle spent 20 years collecting this," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the personal cost of Uncle Ezra's dedication. "Every document here represents a family that was pressured, a community that was damaged, or an environmental crime that went unpunished." The scope of the evidence was staggering. Uncle Ezra had documented illegal mining operations across 4 states, photographed environmental damage that companies had tried to conceal, and recorded conversations that revealed the systematic nature of corporate fraud in the extractive industries. But most significantly, he'd connected individual crimes to a pattern of behavior that demonstrated conspiracy rather than isolated incidents. Clara studied a folder marked Pine Ridge area current threats, and felt her blood run cold as she recognized surveillance photographs of her own cabin, taken from multiple angles over the past 2 years. Uncle Ezra had known that his property was being watched long before his death, and he'd documented the surveillance with the same careful attention he'd given to everything else. He knew they would come for us, she realized. looking at Daniel with growing concern about the risks they'd been facing without knowing it. "He also knew you'd be strong enough to handle it," Jake replied. Ezra spent the last 5 years of his life preparing for this moment when someone he trusted would have the courage to use this evidence the way it was meant to be used. Margaret Hensley arrived. As they were cataloguing the most recent documents, her expression grim as she reviewed materials she'd been expecting but hoping wouldn't be necessary. As Uncle Ezra's legal collaborator, she'd helped him understand the federal requirements for building a prosecutable case against corporate conspiracy. "Clara, this changes everything," Margaret said after examining the evidence cache. "With this level of documentation, federal prosecutors won't just be pursuing mining violations. They'll be building a RICO case against organized criminal activity." The mention of RICO charges sent a chill through the room. Clara had heard enough legal dramas to know that such charges were reserved for cases involving systematic criminal enterprises, carrying penalties that could result in decades of prison time for those convicted. "What does that mean for us?" Daniel asked with the directness that often cut through adult complications to reach essential truths. Margaret's expression carried the careful gravity of someone delivering news that would reshape a family's future. "It means your mother's testimony won't just be supporting a mining fraud case. It will be the keystone evidence in a federal investigation that could dismantle an entire network of corporate corruption." Clara felt the magnitude of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical weight. Uncle Ezra hadn't just left her evidence of individual crimes. He'd left her the power to expose a criminal organization that had been operating across the Rocky Mountain region for decades. Tom Bradley appeared in the cabin doorway, his sheriff's uniform carrying new authority as the local law enforcement coordinator for what had become a multi-state federal investigation. "Clara, we need to talk about security arrangements for the next few days," he said, his tone suggesting that the casual protection he'd been providing was about to become much more serious. "Federal agents are flying in from Denver this afternoon, and there's been increased activity around properties adjacent to yours." The increased activity proved to be more surveillance teams, positioned to monitor anyone approaching or leaving the cabin. Clara realized that their quiet mountain retreat had become the center of a federal operation that would determine the fate of mining rights throughout the region. Agent Sarah Chen arrived with a team of federal investigators who transformed the cabin into a temporary command post. The main room filled with computers, communication equipment, and evidence storage containers that spoke of an operation far more complex than Clara had imagined when she'd first agreed to cooperate. "Mrs. Duvall, I want you to understand what we're asking of you," Agent Chen said, as they reviewed the testimony Clara would be providing. "Your uncle's evidence gives us the foundation for prosecutions that could affect the entire extractive industry in the western United States. But it also means you'll be testifying against people who have demonstrated willingness to use extreme measures to protect their interests." Daniel sat beside Clara, following the adult conversation with the intense attention he'd developed since their family had become central to a federal investigation. At 11, he'd learned to decode legal terminology and understand the implications of decisions that would affect communities throughout the mountain region. "Are we in danger?" he asked with the vulnerable honesty that reminded Clara why she'd chosen to protect his future over her own immediate security. "You're under federal protection," Agent Chen replied carefully. "But I won't lie to you. The people we're investigating have resources and connections that make them formidable opponents." Clara looked around the cabin that had become their sanctuary and realized that their simple mountain life was ending regardless of the choices she made. The question was whether that ending would result in justice for the communities that had been damaged by corporate corruption, or merely in their own family's destruction. Margaret reviewed the legal documents one final time, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades fighting corporate power and understood both the potential for victory and the certainty of retaliation. Clara, tomorrow you'll be presenting evidence to a federal grand jury that will decide whether to indict Vincent Kowalski and his associates on charges that could result in life imprisonment, she said quietly. Your testimony will either result in the largest mining fraud prosecution in American history, or it will make you a target for people who've killed to protect smaller secrets. The stark choice crystallized everything Uncle Ezra had been preparing them for. Clara could walk away, sell what remained of the claim, and disappear into anonymity with enough money to live comfortably. Or she could honor the trust he'd placed in her judgment by using his evidence to seek justice for communities that had no other voice. Jake Morrison stood and moved toward the window, his weathered face showing the strain of someone preparing to testify about crimes he'd participated in decades earlier. Clara, I need you to know something before you make this decision, he said, his voice heavy with guilt that had been accumulating for 35 years. I was there when Kowalski ordered the original theft that started all this. I watched him destroy families and communities for profit while using your uncle's stolen data to identify new targets. If you don't testify, everything Ezra sacrificed to document will die with him. Clara felt Daniel take her hand with the unconscious comfort-giving that children provided in moments of crisis. She looked at her son, who was watching her with absolute trust in her ability to make the right choice, and realized that Uncle Ezra's true inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the opportunity to choose who she wanted to become when confronted with the full complexity of moral responsibility. Agent Chen, she said with a steadiness that surprised her, what do you need me to do? The federal agent smiled with genuine admiration. Tomorrow morning, you'll walk into that courthouse and tell 23 citizens everything your uncle documented about corporate corruption in their communities. And you'll give them the power to hold those responsible accountable for the damage they've caused. As evening settled over the mountains that Uncle Ezra had spent his lifetime protecting, Clara realized that she'd already made the only choice her conscience would allow. The risks were enormous, but so was the opportunity to honor the trust of a man who'd sacrificed everything to gather evidence of injustices that would otherwise never be exposed. Margaret gathered the evidence files with the care of someone handling materials that could reshape federal law enforcement priorities. Clara, regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've already succeeded in the most important way possible. You've chosen courage over comfort. And that's a legacy your son will carry for the rest of his life. Daniel looked around the room at the adults whose lives had been brought together by Uncle Ezra's vision of justice, and Clara could see him processing the magnitude of what they were all risking to pursue accountability for people they'd never met. Mum, he said quietly, I think Uncle Ezra knew we'd be brave enough to do this. Clara pulled her son close and felt the peace that came from making decisions based on principle rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring testimony that could result in the largest corporate prosecution in mining industry history. But tonight she was content knowing that Uncle Ezra's faith in her judgment had been well placed. The treasure he'd left them wasn't silver buried in the mountain. It was the courage to stand up for what was right, even when doing so required risking everything they'd hoped to build for their future. The federal courthouse hummed with activity that felt both official and theatrical. Clara sat in the witness preparation room, watching news vans arrive through the window, their satellite dishes and camera crews transforming the quiet Denver morning into a media circus that would broadcast her family's story across the Rocky Mountain region. Mrs. Duvall, it's time, Agent Chen said, appearing in the doorway with the calm professionalism that had guided Clara through weeks of preparation. The grand jury room was smaller than Clara had expected, filled with 23 citizens who would decide whether Vincent Kowalski and his associates would face criminal charges for decades of corporate corruption. They watched her with the focused attention of people who understood the significance of what they were hearing. Clara raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, aware that this moment represented the culmination of Uncle Ezra's lifetime of careful planning and moral courage. Her voice was steady as she began the testimony that would expose secrets some people had killed to protect. My name is Clara Duvall, and 6 weeks ago I inherited what I thought was a worthless cabin from my uncle. What I actually inherited was evidence of the largest mining fraud case in Colorado history. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named David Walsh, guided Clara through the story with questions that allowed her to tell the truth chronologically. She described finding the hidden documents, discovering Uncle Ezra's coded journals, and learning about the stolen geological surveys that had launched decades of illegal mining operations. Mrs. Duvall, can you tell the jury about the video message your uncle left regarding the origins of his claim? Clara had practiced this part of her testimony dozens of times, but speaking the words in the formal setting of a federal courthouse gave them weight that preparation sessions couldn't replicate. Uncle Ezra confessed that he'd participated in corporate espionage 35 years ago, stealing geological surveys from Apex Mining Corporation. He said Vincent Kowalski had hired him for that operation, and that Kowalski had been using the stolen information to conduct illegal mining on federal land ever since. The grand jurors leaned forward with visible interest, and Clara could see that Uncle Ezra's confession was having the impact Agent Chen had predicted. The story wasn't just about one corrupt mining executive. It was about a conspiracy that had been operating for decades. What evidence did your uncle leave to support these claims? Clara described the hidden room beneath the cabin, the professional surveying equipment, and the comprehensive files documenting Kowalski's illegal activities. She explained how Uncle Ezra had spent years trying to report the corruption through proper channels, only to be told that individual incidents didn't constitute sufficient evidence for prosecution. So your uncle took it upon himself to build a comprehensive case? Yes. He documented everything: license plates of vehicles conducting surveillance, photographs of illegal mining equipment, financial records showing how families were pressured to sell their land below market value. He even recorded phone conversations when he could do it legally. The prosecutor entered Uncle Ezra's files into evidence, and Clara watched the grand jurors examine photographs of environmental damage that Kowalski's operations had caused throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Their faces showed the kind of anger that suggested they understood the scope of what had been hidden from public view. Mrs. Duvall, since inheriting your uncle's claim, have you personally experienced pressure from Vincent Kowalski or his associates? Clara described the uninvited visit to the cabin, the barely veiled threats about forces beyond her control, and the surveillance that Tom Bradley had documented around their property. At any point did Mr. Kowalski or his representatives offer you financial compensation for the claim? $2.5 million, with the stipulation that the sale had to be completed within 30 days, and that I couldn't retain copies of any geological surveys or documentation. Did they explain why the timeline was so restrictive? No, but based on what we learned from Uncle Ezra's files, I believe they were trying to acquire the stolen survey data before federal investigators could examine it. The prosecutor moved through the evidence systematically, establishing not just the facts of the case, but the pattern of behavior that transformed individual crimes into a comprehensive conspiracy. Clara found herself speaking with growing confidence as she realized that the grand jurors were following her testimony with genuine understanding and mounting outrage. Mrs. Duvall, what decision did you make regarding the silver claim once you learned about your uncle's evidence? I decided that exposing the truth was more important than personal wealth. The environmental damage alone represents millions of dollars in taxpayer costs for cleanup, and the communities that have been affected by illegal mining deserve justice. even though cooperating with this investigation means you might lose the financial security the claim represents? Clara looked around the room at the 23 citizens whose decision would determine whether decades of corruption would finally face legal consequences. Uncle Ezra spent 30 years trying to atone for his participation in the original theft. He trusted me to make the choice he wasn't brave enough to make himself. I couldn't live with myself if I chose money over doing what's right. The federal prosecutor had no further questions, but Clara knew that the most difficult part of her testimony was yet to come. Vincent Kowalski's defense attorney would now have the opportunity to challenge her credibility, question her motives, and attempt to discredit the evidence that could send his client to federal prison. As Clara prepared to face hostile questioning designed to destroy everything Uncle Ezra had worked to build, she felt the strength that came from knowing she was fighting not just for her family's future, but for the principle that ordinary citizens could still hold powerful interests accountable when they found the courage to speak. Truth in the face of intimidation. Vincent Kowalski's defense attorney was exactly what Clara had expected: expensive suit, confident demeanor, and the kind of practiced charm that masked predatory instincts. James Hartwell had built his reputation defending corporate executives against federal charges, and his approach to Clara's testimony combined professional courtesy with barely concealed contempt. "Mrs. Duvall, you've painted quite a dramatic picture for the jury today," Hartwell began, his tone suggesting he was about to expose fundamental flaws in her account. "But isn't it true that everything you've told us is based on the word of a man who, by your own testimony, confessed to being a thief?" Clara had prepared for this line of attack, but facing it in the formal setting of the grand jury room still required every ounce of composure she possessed. Uncle Ezra confessed to participating in corporate espionage 35 years ago, she replied carefully. But his confession was supported by decades of documented evidence that can be independently verified. Evidence that conveniently supports a narrative that would make your family wealthy and sympathetic. Hartwell countered. "Isn't it possible that your uncle fabricated this entire story to justify keeping a mineral claim he had no legal right to possess?" "No," Clara said firmly. "The evidence includes photographs, financial records, witness statements, and corroborating testimony from multiple sources. Uncle Ezra couldn't have fabricated material that involves dozens of different families and mining operations spanning 2 decades. Hartwell moved to a different approach, attempting to discredit Clara's motives rather than the evidence itself. "Mrs. Duvall, you've testified that you chose to cooperate with federal investigators rather than sell the mineral claim for $2.5 million. But isn't it true that your attorney advised you that cooperating might result in a larger financial settlement from the federal government?" The question was designed to make Clara appear mercenary, despite her claims of moral motivation. She could see the trap Hartwell was setting, suggesting that her cooperation was motivated by greed rather than principle. "Margaret, Hensley warned me that cooperating with the investigation might result in losing the claim." "Entirely," Clara responded. "She never suggested that testifying would lead to any financial benefit. But surely you're aware that whistleblowers in federal cases often receive substantial compensation for their cooperation." "I'm not a whistleblower seeking compensation," Clara said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that couldn't be manufactured. "I'm someone who inherited evidence of crimes and chose to turn that evidence over to authorities, rather than profit from it," Hartwell attempted. Several more lines of questioning designed to portray Clara as either naive or calculating, but her responses remained consistent and credible. The grand jurors watched the exchange with expressions that suggested they were seeing exactly what Agent Chen had predicted: a corrupt attorney trying to discredit an honest witness through intimidation and misdirection. The defense attorney's final gambit was an attempt to discredit Uncle Ezra's character and mental state. During his final years, Mrs. Duvall, how do you know your uncle was mentally competent when he made this supposed confession? Isn't it possible that age and illness affected his memory and judgment? Clara felt anger rise in her chest at the suggestion that Uncle Ezra's moral courage could be dismissed as mental incapacity. Uncle Ezra spent decades conducting systematic investigations using professional-grade equipment and following proper legal procedures, she said with growing conviction. The quality and comprehensiveness of his documentation demonstrates clear thinking and careful planning, and his confession was corroborated by Jake Morrison, who participated in the original theft and has agreed to testify about Mr. Kowalski's role in ordering it. The mention of Jake's corroborating testimony seemed to catch Hartwell off guard. He quickly moved to conclude his questioning, but Clara could see that his attempts to discredit her testimony had failed to land with the impact he'd hoped for. "No further questions," Hartwell said, his tone suggesting he recognized that prolonging the cross-examination would only reinforce Clara's credibility. After Clara's testimony concluded, Agent Chen escorted her from the grand jury room while the jurors deliberated on whether to issue indictments. The process could take hours or days, but Clara felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the legal outcome. She had told the truth about everything: Uncle Ezra's confession, the evidence he'd gathered, and her own experiences with corporate pressure tactics. Whatever the grand jury decided, she had honored the trust her uncle had placed in her judgment. Daniel was waiting in the courthouse hallway with Margaret and Tom Bradley, his face bright with pride and curiosity about what had happened behind the closed doors of the grand jury room. "How did it go, Mom?" he asked as Clara joined their group. "It went exactly the way Uncle Ezra would have wanted it to go," Clara replied, pulling her son close and feeling the peace that came from knowing she'd made choices she could live with regardless of their consequences. Margaret gathered her files with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades fighting corporate corruption and finally seen an ordinary citizen willing to risk everything for justice. "Mrs. Duvall, regardless of what the grand jury decides, you've already won the most important victory," she said with genuine admiration. "You've proven that truth is more powerful than money, and courage is more valuable than security." As they waited for the grand jury's decision, Clara realized that Uncle Ezra's legacy was already secured. The evidence had been presented, the truth had been told, and the kind of courage he'd hoped to inspire in his family had been demonstrated in the most public forum possible. Whatever happened next would determine legal consequences for Vincent Kowalski and his associates. But the moral victory, the triumph of principle over profit, had already been won. 6 months later, Clara stood on the rebuilt porch of Uncle Ezra's cabin, watching Daniel help Jake Morrison repair the last section of the roof that had leaked since their first day in the mountains. The cabin looked nothing like the broken-down structure they'd inherited: fresh paint, covered weathered siding, new windows let in morning light, and the foundation had been reinforced to last another century. But the most significant changes couldn't be seen from the outside. The federal grand jury had issued indictments against Vincent Kowalski and 5 associates on charges of corporate conspiracy, environmental crimes, and violation of federal mining regulations. 3 of them had already pleaded guilty in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into mining industry corruption throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Kowalski himself was scheduled for trial in the fall, but his company had been forced into bankruptcy by federal seizure of assets and environmental remediation costs. The illegal mining operations Uncle Ezra had documented were being shut down systematically, while contaminated sites were added to the federal Superfund cleanup program. Clara's cooperation with the investigation had ultimately cost her the silver claim, just as Margaret had warned it might. Federal courts had ruled that mineral rights based on stolen geological data could not be legally maintained, even by innocent inheritors. The silver would remain in the ground while environmental impact studies determined whether extraction could ever be conducted safely, but Uncle Ezra's backup planning had proved more generous than Clara had dared hope. The trust fund he'd established for Daniel's education had grown over the years to nearly $500,000, more than enough to guarantee college and graduate school at any institution he chose. Additionally, the federal government had provided a settlement that compensated Clara for her cooperation and covered the legal costs associated with losing the original claim. Most importantly, Clara had discovered that the wealth Uncle Ezra truly wanted to leave them had nothing to do with silver or money. Margaret Hensley climbed the porch steps carrying a file folder and the expression of someone bringing good news. At 70, she'd officially retired from practicing law, but she'd agreed to help establish the Clara Duvall Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting citizens who documented corporate environmental crimes. The first applications are starting to come in, Margaret announced, settling into the porch chair that had become hers during her frequent visits to the mountains. 3 families in Montana, 2 in Wyoming, and a coalition of ranchers in New Mexico. All of them have been documenting illegal activities, but didn't know how to bring their evidence to federal attention. Clara felt a familiar surge of satisfaction at the news. The foundation represented the continuation of Uncle Ezra's work, providing resources and legal support for ordinary citizens who found themselves confronting corporate corruption in their communities. Daniel looked up from his roofing work with the focused attention he gave to all adult conversations that might affect their family's mission. "Are we going to help all of them?" he asked. "As many as we can," Clara replied. "That's what the foundation is for, making sure people don't have to face these battles alone the way Uncle Ezra did." Jake climbed down from the roof and joined their porch conversation, his weathered face showing the kind of peace that came from finally making amends for decades-old mistakes. Federal prosecutors had granted him immunity in exchange for his testimony, and he'd used his freedom to become the Foundation's first field investigator. "I got word from Agent Chen this morning," he said. "The Kowalski investigation has expanded to include operations in 4 states. Your uncle's documentation is helping federal prosecutors build cases that go back 20 years. The scope of Uncle Ezra's impact continued to amaze Clara. His patient, systematic approach to gathering evidence had created a foundation for prosecutions that would reshape how federal authorities addressed mining industry corruption. Tom Bradley's patrol car appeared on the mountain road, making his daily check on the property that had become a symbol of citizen courage throughout Pine Ridge. The sheriff had been elected to the county commission the previous month, running on a platform of environmental protection and corporate accountability that reflected how dramatically the community's priorities had shifted. "Clara." "Daniel," Tom said as he climbed the porch steps, "thought you'd want to know. The county just approved the conservation easement for the national forest land adjacent to your property. It'll be protected from any future mining development. The conservation easement represented the final piece of Uncle Ezra's environmental legacy. The land where illegal mining had caused so much damage would be restored and protected, ensuring that the wilderness he'd fought to preserve would remain intact for future generations." As afternoon sunlight slanted across the mountain valley, Clara reflected on how completely her understanding of inheritance had changed since that first morning when they discovered the hidden trunk. She'd thought Uncle Ezra had left them property and money, but his true legacy was far more valuable: the knowledge that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they found the courage to stand up for what was right. Daniel had thrived in the mountain environment, growing stronger and more confident as he took on responsibilities with the Foundation's work. At 11, he could identify mining equipment from photographs, explain environmental restoration techniques, and discuss federal regulatory procedures with the casual expertise of someone who'd grown up around important work. But more than that, he'd learned that his family's story was part of something larger, a tradition of people who chose principle over profit and community responsibility over personal security. "Mom," Daniel said as they watched the sun set behind the peaks that Uncle Ezra had spent his lifetime protecting, "do you think we'll stay here forever?" Clara looked around at the people who'd become their chosen family through shared commitment to Uncle Ezra's mission. Margaret with her legal expertise, Jake with his hard-won wisdom, and Tom with his steady dedication to community service. She thought about the families across the region who were learning to document corporate crimes and fight for environmental justice. Knowing they had support from the foundation Uncle Ezra's courage had made possible. "I think we'll stay as long as there's work to be done," she said, pulling Daniel close and feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they'd found their true purpose. "And I think Uncle Ezra would be proud of what we've built with the gift he gave us." As stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, brighter than they'd ever been in the city, Clara realized that Uncle Ezra's true inheritance hadn't been silver or money. It had been the opportunity to discover that they possessed the kind of courage that could change the world, one documented injustice and one act of moral courage at a time. The treasure they'd found was exactly what Daniel had said it was, not silver buried in the mountain, but the strength to stand up for what was right, the community that formed around shared principles, and the knowledge that they were part of something bigger than their own small lives. It was an inheritance that would last forever.